Hello, and welcome back to Unit 6 Reproduction. Today we'll be looking at Unit 6 Reproduction, Asexual Reproduction, Day 2. And today's aim is how does asexual reproduction form identical daughter cells? And identical is referring to exactly the same as. And this phrase, daughter cells, is maybe new vocabulary, and this refers to the products of mitosis. We call those cells daughter cells. So these first couple of questions are true and false. So asexual reproduction results in offspring that are identical to the previous generation, exactly the same as, and we know asexual reproduction, there's only one parent, so the offspring are going to be exactly the same as that one parent. So that's true. In asexual reproduction, two parents are involved in creating offspring. It's only one parent. And so that one is false. Asexual reproduction occurs only in unicellular species. That is false. We know mitosis happens in humans. Mitosis happens in animals. It is cell reproduction inside of humans, and that's asexual reproduction. So mitosis happens in humans. And obviously, we also saw yesterday that asexual reproduction can be used by plants to reproduce as well. And most plants are multicellular. So unicellular, meaning only one cell. And we know that it's not just unicellular species. And you might also remember from day one that the way unicellular species asexually produce, at least in living environment, we're usually talking about binary fission with like bacteria and amoebas, how they reproduce. But we're not going to get too heavily into that in living environment. Asexual reproduction is a way to ensure that there is a wide variety of offspring with many different combinations of DNA. False. And thinking about the question that you got at the end of yesterday's assignment, what problems could arise if an entire crop species, for example, is all genetically identical, all reproduces via asexual reproduction. That would mean they're all vulnerable to the same diseases because they're all genetically identical. Sexual reproduction is the way to ensure that there is a wide variety of offspring with many different combinations of DNA. And that is why humans and other complex organisms usually sexually reproduce, so that we can have greater genetic diversity. And we'll talk much more about that when we talk about meiosis, which is the production of gametes and how exactly that process contributes to genetic variations and diversity. So on here, we're taking a look at the basic components of the genetic makeup of a human and sort of going through these in like terms of size. So we have here inside of a cell, and inside of the cell, there is the nucleus. So this is sort of like the largest one. We have the cell, and then the nucleus is the second largest. 1, 2, then we have the chromosomes. So you can see there are many chromosomes inside of the nucleus. And then inside of each chromosome, there is the coiled DNA molecule. So this is sort of going from largest to smallest here. So on each chromosome, there are many coiled DNA molecules. And then within each coiled molecule of DNA, we have the nucleotides. So we can see those going sort of like in size order. Inside each cell, there are many chromosomes, and on each chromosome, there are many molecules of DNA that contain many genes. Okay, so this will be explained more in this reading here. And there's nothing really for you to write on here. You just want to use that image as your reference, and you also want to be able to reference that image when we do the reading below. So a gene is a segment of DNA that codes for RNA and protein. A single molecule of DNA has thousands of genes lined up. So a single molecule of DNA has thousands of genes. So when we're looking at this level 4 here, thousands of genes are present. And when we're talking about genes, when we're using that word, usually, with a G, not blue jeans with a J, we're talking about traits usually, right? How we perceive our genes to be, but many genes can control just one trait, and some traits can be controlled by only one gene. But the gene is the actual molecular component of your DNA that controls for different aspects of your full organism. And specifically what a gene is coding for, sort of how we get our traits from genes, is the RNA and protein used to actually build these structures in the organism. So a single molecule of DNA has thousands of genes lined up like the cars of a train. When genes are being used, the strand of DNA is stretched out so that the information it contains can be decoded and used to direct the synthesis of proteins needed by the cell. So when we're thinking about what's happening in the cell, the instructions for what proteins to synthesize are held inside the nucleus, and those instructions are sent from the nucleus to the ribosomes so that they can synthesize all of the proteins that are needed by the cell. And when that happens, that is how different cells are reproduced. That is how an organism grows and develops, depending upon what's needed. That directs the synthesis of the specific proteins that are needed at that time, whether they be enzymes or entire other parts of the organism. As a eukaryotic cell prepares to divide, the DNA and the proteins associated with the DNA coil into a structure called a chromosome. So the chromosomes are really only visible just as the cell is ready to divide. So this image that we're seeing here, that cell, those chromosomes are sort of very tightly packed. We can actually see them. And you might remember that it is thanks to Gila, or Henrietta Lacks, her actual name, that we even know what chromosomes look like. And they get like that. They appear tightly wound like that when they're ready to divide. So before the DNA coils up, however, the DNA is copied. So the DNA needs to be replicated. In the case of asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction, we need to copy the DNA. But in the case of asexual reproduction, the DNA is an exact copy. So the two exact copies of DNA that make up each chromosome are called chromatids. And this is kind of complex vocabulary assignment here. Don't allow yourself to get too confused with chromosome versus chromatid. The truth is that we're really sort of glossing over something that's very complex. And one day when you take AP biology or you take more advanced biology classes in college, this will make a little bit more sense. But for our purposes, just think of one single chromosome is a single chromosome, but this is also a chromatid. And don't let it confuse you too much. It is just important when we're talking about replication. But again, in living environment, we're sort of glossing over DNA replication. And we'll talk more about it in Unit 7 when we actually talk in depth about genetics. But for our purposes here, this is all we need to know. So the two exact copies of DNA that make up each chromosome are called chromatids. In the chromatids, the DNA is very condensed. The two chromatids, which become separated during cell division and are placed into each new cell, thus ensures that each new cell has the same genetic information as the original cell. So in this case, we're talking about two chromatids, and they are exact copies of each other. So one, it goes into each new cell, they're segregated into the two different cells. And then when they're actually in the new cell, they replicate. So there's a complete set of chromosomes, and that's that. So how are genes and DNA related? So we see here that on each strand of DNA, there are thousands of genes. So genes are stored in our DNA. Each strand of DNA carries thousands of genes. Lined up like the cars of a train. And really that's because, and again, we're going to talk a lot more about DNA when we get to Unit 7 and talk about genetics. So it's coming right up after this, don't worry. But it's because our DNA is such a complex molecule. Our DNA contains all of the information needed to build every single one of the cells in our bodies, and only, some cells need some segments of DNA. So a lot of our DNA isn't being necessarily used to encode proteins, depending upon which cell is being discussed, and which proteins are being synthesized, which genes are being activated. And this is a complex process. We're going to talk about differentiation. But again, in living environment, we're sort of glossing over something that could be taught in several very advanced biology classes. And molecular biology is its own concept, sort of like the science of DNA is still, being discovered. So what occurs to a DNA strand as its genes are being used? The strand of DNA is stretched out and decoded. And sort of that process of reading DNA and DNA replication is what we're going to talk about more in Unit 7. How are chromatids and chromosomes related? And again, we're getting these answers right directly from this text that we just read. But the two exact copies of DNA that make up each chromosome are called chromatids. A train is to cars as a molecule of DNA is to genes. So the train is the molecule of DNA and it has the many genes lined up, just like the cars on a train. And all right, we're almost done here. You can't see this image on my handout, although you should be able to see it on yours, but I'll go ahead and draw it in. But first, drawing conclusions, appropriate because I'm about to draw. Before a cell undergoes asexual reproduction, in order to make new daughter cells, what must occur inside of the cell to form identical offspring, and why? So in order to make new daughter cells, in order to reproduce, what needs to happen inside of the cell to form the identical offspring? The DNA must be replicated. And this is because without two copies of the DNA, you're not going to be able to form identical offspring. We cannot form identical offspring. And in class tomorrow, which might be like before you're doing this assignment, but in class on Tuesday, we're going to watch an animation of mitosis actually go through. And so we don't need to memorize the cells really, but just know that the majority of a cell's life cycle, it is undergoing some part of the cell cycle. It's usually an interphase, but inside of a given tissue sample, there may be many cells that are in different phases of mitosis, because this is just a process that's ongoing all of the time in the cells of multicellular organisms like plants and animals like us. So in the case of mitosis, this 2N represents sort of the copies of DNA. So this is a full set of chromosomes we've got here in this cell. The offspring at this point here, we've got 2 copies of DNA. So the DNA has been replicated here, but it's still housed in one nucleus. But it is still just one complete cell, but it's about to divide into the 2 genetically identical offspring. And this is sort of an incomplete diagram at this point. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare this diagram to a diagram of meiosis, which is quite different. So there's nothing for you to write on this part D. You just want to go on and do your exit ticket, but just know that this diagram is going to make more sense when we compare it to meiosis a little bit later. So, all right, that's all I have for you today. This was Asexual Reproduction Day 2, and today's aim was, how does asexual reproduction form identical daughter cells? And the answer there is by precisely copying the DNA. By making an exact copy of the genetic information, the cells are able to form identical daughter cells. They're able to form exact copies because of the correct replication of the DNA. And tomorrow we'll do Asexual Reproduction Day 3. Have a super fantastic day, guys, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye.